you, Africa. As I said, I'm responsible for managing this evening. I'll be moderating the proceedings, and as I said also, I'm Andre Fenton, I'm from the Physics Department, and it's really a pleasure for me to welcome you all at this very significant evening for us. 20 July 2017, we remembered at the University for two significant reasons. Firstly, today marks the official name change of the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. It is now called Nelson Mandela University, consistent with the drive to associate this university with the significant life of the liberator and former President of South Africa, Mr. Nelson Mandela. The other significant occasion is, of course, this evening. The debate on religious belief systems and whether there is evidence for the existence of God. This is a first for PE, and we are very privileged for esteemed scientists from the humanities and the natural sciences, respectively, here tonight to debate this significant question. Now, what is tonight not about? Tonight is not an active attempt to convert you to a particular religion or worldview. In the true spirit of universities, this is a platform for presenting evidence and discuss ideas in search of truth in a safe and nurturing space. So what is tonight then about? The specialist whom I will introduce in a minute or two from now will debate this fundamental question. Does God exist? Can we present reasonable evidence to support or refute the existence of God? This is, of course, no insignificant question. As you may know, Pascal's wager, or so-called gamble, is an argument of philosophy devised by the French theist philosopher, mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal, somewhere between 1623 and 1662. This argument postulates that humans bet their lives that God exists or does not exist. The question will remain with us until the end of time. If you believe God does exist, you will have eternal life and happiness. If you are wrong, well, then eternal nothingness follows death. If you support the atheist view, nothingness is your inheritance anyway. If the atheist worldview is, however, wrong, according to Pascal's wager or gamble philosophy, eternal suffering is waiting. I do not for one moment suggest that one should believe or support a particular view because you want to escape possible calamity. Any possible worldview should be the product of honest introspection and grappling with difficult questions in search of truth. Questions such as, why are we here? Is there some divine purpose? What is truth? What is reality? Do we have free will? Is there a transcendental creator? Or perhaps, is there a perfectly plausible scientific explanation divorced from a divine designer for creation and the origin of man? Some of you are sitting here tonight believing that God exists. Some may be convinced that He does not exist, and others may not be sure. Whatever you believe, I trust that tonight will be an enlightening experience, and sincerely hope that you will find the discussions, the debate, both stimulating and thought-provoking. Please remember to formulate your questions, if you haven't done so yet, in advance, as there will be opportunity for you later on to ask them. Now let me introduce to you our special guests and specialist debaters. Our first specialist tonight is Dr. Richard G. Howe. He will be presenting the Christian argument. Dr. Richard G. Howe is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Apologetics at the Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Howe has a BA in Bible from Mississippi College, an MA in Philosophy from the University of Mississippi, and a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Arkansas. Both his master's thesis and doctoral dissertation focused on the issue of the existence of God. Dr. Howe is the president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, He's a writer as well as a public speaker and debater in churches, conferences and university campuses on issues concerning Christian apologetics and philosophy. He has spoken and or debated in churches and universities across the world. Please welcome Dr. Howard Paul Elizabeth to the Nelson. Our second debater is Professor Bert Olivier. He is a household name in Port Elizabeth. He's been associated with this university for many, many years. Bert is now serving, unfortunately, the University of the Free State. It will be wonderful to be having him with us still. Bert Olivier is extraordinary professor of philosophy at the University of the Free State. He's published widely in philosophy, psychoanalysis, cultural and social theory, philosophy of cinema, architecture, literature, and media. NMME awarded him a distinguished professorship in 2012, and he received the Stals Prize for Philosophy from the South African, and here I've got to throw in a little bit of Afrikaans, die Suid-Afrikaanse Akademie vir Wetenskap en Kuns, in 2004. In addition to philosophy, he's been teaching and writing on other great loves, on his other great loves, namely nature, culture, the arts, architecture and literature. In the face of the many irrational actions on the part of people and wanting to understand these, later on he branched out into psychoanalysis and the social theory as well. And because philosophy cultivates in one a strong sense of justice, he has more recently been harnessing what little knowledge he has in intellectual opposition to the injustice brought about by the dominant economic system, to wit, neoliberalism capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism. His motto is taken from Immanuel Kant's work, Sapere Aude, which is Latin for dare to know or think for yourself. In 2012, Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University conferred a distinguished professorship on him. That is attached to the University of the Free State, as I already said. Let's welcome Bert Olivier. Our third guest is Professor Henk Stoker. He also defends the Christian argument. I probably forgot to say that, if I may go back one step, Bert is representing the agnostic argument. Professor Henk Stoker, also representing the Christian argument, is currently Apologetics and Ethics Professor at the Faculty of Theology of the Northwest University, as well as the Theology Seminary of the Reformed Churches in South Africa in Potchefstroom. He holds the following earned degrees. He has a BA Honours in Philosophy and Psychology. He has got an MA in Philosophy, a THB degree in Theology, and a PhD in Apologetics, which he received in 1993. He served on the Executive Committee of the Faculty of Theology as Director of Masters and PhD programs at that particular university. He also served on the following committees of the General Synod of the Reformed Churches in South Africa, the Executive Board of Curators, and the Church Revitalization Committee. And he's also involved in church education, youth ministry committees, organizing national youth camps. He published 2 books on ethics and 1 on apologetics, and also wrote endorsements for the book Reform Means Missional, Follow Jesus into the World. Let's welcome Professor Stoker. Then our last specialist, certainly not least, is Martin de Wit, also an academic from the Nelson Mandela University. Martin is Professor of Earth Stewardship Science and Science Director for Africa Earth Observatory Network Earth Stewardship Research Institute at the NMMU, a chartered geologist who has helped define a new discipline, Earth Stewardship Science, IPACADE, which means observe the present and consider the past in order to ponder the future. This event to holistically tackle problems affecting the planet, its shared resources, and its people. He's held research positions at Columbia University, New York, the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston, and professorships at Massachusetts Institution of Technology, or Institute of Technology, MIT, the well-known MIT, the Institute Physique the Globe in Paris, Germany's National Research Center on Earth Sciences in Potsdam, University of Utrecht, and Kingston University in Canada, where he was awarded a DSc. He's an honorary fellow of the Geological Society of London, UK, and of the USA, and a founder member of AON in South Africa. He has supervised 88 thesis-based postgraduate students, that's meaning PhDs and MScs. He recently got awarded a gold medal from the South African Association for the Advancement of Science. Martin was born in Holland. He was educated in Ireland and the UK. He traveled for many years across the Americas, Antarctica, and Europe, and finally settled in South Africa. He's an atheist with an interest in African spiritual stories and heritage. Please welcome Professor Martin de Wit. So now you know who we're dealing with. They are all extremely specialized individuals, and they like arguing. So I'm pretty sure that tonight will be a lively debate, and we rely on you to contribute to making this evening successful. The proceedings will be as follows. I will soon call up the specialists to make an opening statement regarding their worldview. It will be followed by a rebuttal of about approximately 5 minutes each. If you do not mind, please just stick to the time. Closing remarks from the specialists will then follow. And then it's time for great fun. Asking questions from the audience. Yeah, as I said, if you haven't formulated your questions yet, please do so while these gentlemen are debating this very, very fundamental question about the existence of God. So welcome once again. It's wonderful to have you all with us, and I sincerely trust that you will be enjoying the evening. So the opening statement will be made by Professor Richard Howe. He will then be followed by Professor Bart Olivier, will be followed by Professor Stoker, and then finally we will have Martin de Wit address us. Welcome, Professor Howe.
The challenge, I think, when the debate, either formal or just casual conversation, when it's framed in terms of something versus Christianity. In my experience, at least, Christianity is so multifaceted that you can have challenges from anything from, gee, where did all the water come from if the earth was actually flooded, to, well, how do you deal with Kant's claim that existence is not a predicate vis-a-vis the cosmological argument, and everything in between. Now, what I try to do when these kind of confrontations occur, when people talking about their different points of view, I'm convinced that one of the most important things to do, assuming that there are philosophical foundations upon which we can agree, like logic and reason, these kind of things. Although, if that's not there in any given situation, you have to back up and massage the conversation a little to get someone maybe to agree to the rules of logic and reason. Aside from that, I think the most important way to situate the conversation is in the context of whether God does or doesn't exist. So I would just like to make a few comments with respect to how I see the question about Christianity vis-a-vis other views of the world in the context of theism. when you talk about the truth of the Christian faith, the truths of the specific claims of Christianity will invariably involve things like miraculous, Jesus rising from the dead, for example. And other issues, too, will come up that I think are unavoidably connected with this question of God's existence. And so that's why I want to address it this way. And all I can get away with in a 10-minute introduction is more or less like a table of contents, each of which points to a chapter that you could spend time in research and reading. So if you'll allow me, I'm just going to give a skeletal little gesture here, and then maybe during the back and forth in the Q&A. Although typically when I have these situations, I always try to get the moderators to just do Q and not do any A. Because then you get a whole lot more questions in. That's a great question, yes. Okay, how about you? Yes, that's a really great question. We got 600 questions in a half an hour. But let me just give you two quick arguments, if you will, albeit there's a table of contents pointing to the unpacking of it. One has to do with the question of God's existence with respect to the universe coming into existence, the beginning of the universe. The other has to do with the question of God's existence with respect to the current existing of the universe. Now, when it comes to the first one, where God is somehow posited as an explanatory hypothesis or the causal agent regarding the universe coming into existence and having a beginning, this is now more often than not referred to as the Kalam, K-A-L-A-M, cosmological argument. And it flourished in medieval Islam. It was celebrated by some medieval Christians, but it was typically eclipsed by the influence of other Christians who weren't quite sympathetic to the argument. The argument basically says this: the universe began to exist, first premise. Second, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence or a cause of its beginning to exist. Therefore, the universe began to exist. In my experience now, almost without exception, when this argument is advanced by a theist or a Christian apologist in particular, the evidence marshaled for the premise that the universe began to exist is scientific evidence. Things like the Big Bang Theory, which points to a beginning of the universe a finite time ago. Things like the second law of thermodynamics, which tries to argue that if the universe was eternal, it would have expended all of its usable energy by now. Or questions like issues like the expanding universe, where you can extrapolate backwards to a cosmic singularity behind which presumably nothing existed. Now, Professor Stoika is going to address more directly some of these, maybe the details of some of the science. So I'm going to leave that to him, because what I'd like to do is sketch out a philosophical argument for the beginning of the universe. And it basically takes two forms. And again, don't forget, I'm just giving you the skeleton here. One of them has to do with the possibility of whether one could traverse an actual infinite. And so the argument basically would say, if the past is infinite, then the past is an actual, what mathematicians call an actual infinite. And so the argument would try to show that if that was the case, then you could demonstrate mathematically certain contradictions. For example, an illustration is used from a famous novel by Lawrence Stern called The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, gentlemen. And Tristram Shandy in the novel is writing his autobiography. Problem is, it takes him a whole year to write one day's event. So the first year of his life, he's writing about the first day of his life. The second year of his life, he's writing about the second day of the first year. Third year of his life, he's writing about the third day of the first year, and on and on and on. Mathematicians picked up on this and said, is it possible that given an infinite length of time, Tristram Shandy might finish his autobiography? And indeed, you can actually show mathematically a one-to-one correspondence between every year of writing of Tristram Shandy's life and every day of living of Tristram Shandy's life. So the philosophers picked up on this and said, well, what if Tristram Shandy had been writing from eternity past? Then you could show mathematically that Tristram Shandy will have finished his autobiography right now. But you could also show that he would have finished it a year ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000,000 years ago. In fact, no matter how far back in the past you go, you can show that he will have already finished his autobiography. And now we have a contradiction, because Tristram Shandy has been writing his autobiography from eternity past, and Tristram Shandy has been finished writing his autobiography from eternity past. And these kind of things go into this whole conundrum in some people's mind about the mathematics of infinite set theories. The other has to do with the actual existence of an actual infinite, whether you can have an entire actual infinite like the past. And again, it's usually done by reductio ad absurdum, where you give these counterintuitive illustrations. If that was true, this would follow. That is absurd, therefore it's not true. Now, as to this second question about God as the cause of the existing of the universe, in my experience, again, it strikes people as an odd way to even frame an existing question. Typically, in my experience, people think of things coming into existence, and you pretty much are satisfied that from that point forward, it has this sort of existential inertia, that it can just coast along in existence. But Thomas Aquinas likens the notion of existing as an act. It is something that essences or substances do. And an analogy I use with my students is like music. So if you came in here today and there was a big giant glass crystal ball that I saw once when I was in Venice, Italy, and somebody said, well, gee, where did that giant crystal ball come from? You say, well, there's a factory, further up the coast, and they make these things for promotional, and we bought it to promote the dialogue tonight. You're pretty satisfied with that explanation. You've got a reason why you have the crystal ball. But suppose, in contrast to that, you were hearing music. Unlike the crystal ball, you would not ask, where did that music come from? Instead, you would ask, where is the music coming from? Because unlike the ball in the analogy, music only is music inasmuch as it is being caused to be music at every instance that is music. As soon as the musician stops causing the music just ceases to be. So this understanding is part of, I think, what Aquinas was trying to get at when he talked about the existence of creation. And so he wanted to try to argue that anything that exists either exists by virtue of the kind of thing it is, or it's being caused to exist. The problem is, if existence is an act that is only going on in a substance, then somewhere, if anything exists at all, something must exist whose very essence is existence itself. And this is what Aquinas argued what God was. In fact, Aquinas and others have tried to tether this to the conversation between God and Moses in the book of Exodus. And when Moses was commissioned by God to go to the children of Israel, he said, they're going to ask me what your name is. Who do I tell them sent me? And God said, you tell them that my name is I am who I am. So when they ask you, you tell them I am has sent you to them. And I think that what Moses was hearing that was a sort of nascent form of what philosophers centuries later tried to unpack in terms of the contours of God being a being who is ipsum esse subsistent, substantial existence itself, as the explanation of why it is that even though I exist as a human, and it's not part of my essence to exist as a human, I am being given existence at every instance by some being whose very essence is existence itself. Thank you.
That's a hard act to follow. I'll try. I am here to defend the position known as agnosticism. Well, I assume there are some people here who know what agnosticism is. Hands up, who knows what agnosticism is? Right. Agnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But agnosticism specifically is it's either the denial that we can have knowledge of God, that we have knowledge of God, or for that matter can have knowledge of God, finite creatures that we are, whereas the God of theism is typically depicted in theology and in philosophy as an eternal, omniscient, ubiquitous being everywhere at once. In other words, not restricted by space and time as we are. So the question is, how can we, limited beings that we are, know a being who is infinite, ubiquitous, omniscient, omnipotent, and all those things? Our faculties simply don't reach that far. Okay. More strictly speaking, agnosticism is the view that is not even a view, it's just a kind of a nonchalance about God or gods. You know, a lack of interest in whether God or the gods exist at all. But I'd like to follow a certain approach tonight to make the position clear. And that approach is to make a fundamental distinction between knowledge and religious belief, or in one word, faith. Geloof in Afrikaans. And this is already implicit in the argument of an early Christian thinker, Tertullian, from the 3rd century AD, or as we say today, CE, who said famously, "Credo quia absurdum." I believe because it is absurd. Now that seems like a contradiction. What on earth could he have possibly have meant? What he meant was simply that what I believe, and he did believe in God, is an object of belief. It's not knowledge. In terms of knowledge, it is absurd. I mean, take something like the Trinity, being 1 and 3 at the same time, the so-called Christological question in theology. How can anything be 1 and 3 at the same time? It's a mystery. So if you believe that absurdity, all you can do is believe it. You can't know it. Why? Because knowledge in human terms is restricted to spatio-temporal phenomena, things that appear in space and time. Does God appear in space and time? No, God does not. Some of you may know that wonderful novel by John Fowles, The Magus, where the Magus of the story, Conscious, witnesses a blind woodcutter in Norway falling to his knees in a stream and addressing God, and Conscious, being a scientist, goes back wondering to himself, not doubting for one moment that the woodcutter was seeing something, some pillar of fire or something. And he says later to one of his proteges, no matter what we do in science, we can never find the categories to explain or understand what, I think his name was Eric, what Eric was seeing there. Precisely. Religious experience, when reported to others, is always a report of some private experience. It is not, as we say in science, falsifiable because other people can't test it. If a person has a mystical experience of God, it is typically private. In other words, it is something that is related to that person and that person alone. It is not knowledge that can be communicated. Now, the person, allow me this little bit of philosophy, and please follow, because I can also, like my predecessor, give you a thumbnail sketch of a huge book called The Critique of Pure Reason, written and published by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, probably the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, basically, this is the sketch he gives of human reason. He says, all of us share, no matter what we are, what race, what culture, what gender, all of us share the same structure of reason or rationality. On the lowest level, space and time, or sensibility. We see things in space and time. It's basically the level of perception. But perception, he says, would be blind were it not for the concepts of the understanding that allow us to interpret the objects of perception. And those concepts, or what he also called categories, are things like causality, unity, diversity, relation, modality, and so on. In other words, we always experience something as being the cause of something else, or the effect of something else. That's how the concept of causality operates in interpreting things around us. Now, these two things together, the forms of space and time, and the categories or concepts of the understanding, form a synthesis which gives us the experiential world. That is the world of knowledge. Then there are the ideas that he also called regulative ideas of God, the self, and the world. But these ideas are not concepts. Why not? Because they don't have empirical content. Nowhere do we experience the world in its entirety. We experience Venice, or we experience what I see in front of me, or you sitting there. And I assume this is part of the world, but no one has ever had immediate access to the world or the universe in its totality. You can't. You just assume that world is there as a coherent whole. The same with the self. we assume that when I feel sad, this self, but all I feel is sadness. You never see the self face to face. And I'm not talking about selfies or the mirror. That's your body you see. It's not yourself. Okay? The self is something we assume as supporting all our diverse experiences. And God, where does the idea of God come from? Precisely because Kant says reason cannot tolerate the thought of anything that is uncaused. So the world, we say we reason from, birds hatch from eggs, and those birds also hatch from eggs, and so on ad infinitum. But sooner or later you must make a cutoff point. You must say, but okay, where do all these things come from? What caused them? And a scientist may say the Big Bang, but most people say, the original cause, the cause that caused everything. We call that God. But, says Kant, that is not an object of experience. Kant is precisely what he calls a regulative idea, because it gives coherence to our knowledge without itself being the object of knowledge. In other words, Kant, although Kant was, I must tell you, quite a devout Christian, how could that be? Precisely because Kant, like Tertullian, knew the difference between faith and knowledge. Kant, as a philosopher talking about knowledge, had to say, we can't know God. But as a believer, he believed in God. Many people after Kant said the same thing. The most famous of these probably being the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who talked about the leap into darkness of faith. And I like that metaphor, the leap into darkness. When you have faith in God, he said, what you are doing is actually entering a darkness which is not, like Kant, which is not the object of knowledge. And I think that Kant's philosophy, before Kant said all this out that I've just told you, he deals with all the proofs for God's existence that occurred throughout the Middle Ages, like the argument from design, the ontological argument, and the one that my colleague there explained to you. And Kant showed in detail that all of those presuppose the existence of God. In other words, they are circular. They are not proofs that can be accepted. So Kant's position is actually the most fully fledged position of agnosticism. Thank you.
You've heard about evidence, you've heard about knowledge. If we really want to make a case, we must see what evidence we have for different sides. That's the way that it also works in a court. That's also when we have arguments. And all of us believe in reason. And even if you say faith is something that is not knowledge, you have a problem, because by saying that, you make a faith statement. Okay, so why believe in the Bible? I only have time to give 3 reasons why the Old Testament as manuscripts can be seen as reliable. You see, I'm working from a scientific background. The one, textual transmission, the accuracy of the copying process down through history is extraordinary. I don't have time to explain why. 2, the confirmation of the Old Testament by hard evidence uncovered through archaeology, and 3, documentary evidence also uncovered through archaeology. But let's come to the New Testament, and now I'm going to talk about evidence. The New Testament documents were written by eyewitnesses or their contemporaries. And the New Testament historical data is in coherence with the writing of non-Christians of that time. I've read 16 non-Christians to make sure of that. The New Testament writers were accurate, as evidenced by well over 140 historical confirmed details. They refer to facts and eyewitnesses that their readers either already knew or could verify. In fact, the New Testament writers provoke their readers and prominent first century enemies to check out what they said. If that is not enough to confirm their truthfulness, then their martyrdom should remove any doubt. These eyewitnesses endured persecution and death for the empirical claim that they had seen, heard, and touched the risen Jesus. Yet they could have saved themselves by simply denying their testimony. While many people will die for a lie that they think is true, no sane person will die for what they know is a lie. The New Testament writers and the other apostles knew for sure that Jesus had resurrected, and they demonstrated that knowledge with their own blood and with the blood of their friends and family. They only gained persecution and death for testifying as they did. The New Testament writers had every motive to deny New Testament evidence, but they relentlessly stuck to the truth of it. What more could eyewitnesses do to prove that they are telling the truth? They proclaimed Jesus' resurrection, but the question is, was Jesus really dead when the Roman soldiers took him off the cross? Enemies and friends alike believed Jesus was dead. The Romans were professional executors. They whipped and beat Jesus brutally to the point of his collapse. Then they drove heavy iron nails through his wrist and feet and plugged a spear into his side. I have an article of the Journal of American Medical Association where 3 medical doctors, all researchers, write, clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports a traditional view that the spear thrust between the right rib probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the heart and other things that I cannot even pronounce. Even if everyone was wrong about Jesus being dead when he went into the tomb, how would the badly injured and bleeding man still be alive 36 hours later? He would have bled to death in that cold, dark tomb. Even if he did survive the cold, dark tomb. You see, I'm speaking the language that is most spoken around the world, and that's bad English. Even if he did survive the cold, dark tomb, how could he unwrap himself, move the 2-ton rock up and away from the inside of the tomb, get by the elite Roman guards who would be killed for allowing the breach of security, and then convince the scared, scattered, skeptical disciples that he had triumphed over death? Even if he could get out of the tomb past the Roman guards, Jesus would have been a battered, bleeding man whom the disciples would pity, not worship. They'd say, you may be alive, but you're certainly not risen. Let's go to a dog. Was Jesus' tomb really empty Easter Sunday? If it wasn't, the Jewish or Roman authorities would simply parade Jesus' body around the city. You know, Christianity started in Jerusalem. That was set in Jerusalem. Even 200 years later, when you read what the Jews and the Romans write about it, they all say that tomb was empty. So it's really a consensus that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, why did they believe? Were they all deceived by hallucinations? That's not possible. Hallucinations are not experienced by groups, but only by individuals. In that regard, they are a lot like dreams. Jesus did not appear once to just one person. He appeared on a dozen separate occasions in a variety of settings to different people over a 40-day period. A total of more than 500 people who knew Jesus before his crucifixion saw the risen Jesus. All of them was willing to die for the truth. If you want evidence, this is evidence. But let's go to the creation, because that's the other way that we can learn if there's evidence for a God. Today there is a remarkable consensus that the universe had a beginning. Attempts at explaining the universe from the universe itself ends in contradictions every time. I've read through a lot of them. The more we find out about the universe, the more the hypothesis that the Creator God designed the universe for a purpose is seen as the best explanation by most people. And you must know that more than 90% of the world believe there's a God or a divinity that created everything. The choice that every human being is confronted with is to believe that God created the heaven and earth in the beginning, as the first verse of the Bible says, or to believe that everything happened accidentally without plan, just out of nothing. But nothing comes from nothing. A world so brilliant made that even our foremost scientists do only understand a little of it and keep on exploring and discovering and applying what they found cannot come from nothing. Nothing is completely devoid of matter or energy. It cannot create. For that reason, it is illogical to say that the universe had exploded from its own power from nothing to something. If something exists, it has to come from somewhere, or it has to be there eternally. Otherwise, it cannot exist. Laws cannot be the creating agent of the universe, and that's what you will read with a lot of the new atheists of today. There are, for instance, different laws that are valid when a billiard ball moves over a table. But it took the billiard cue and not laws to put everything in motion. The laws help in determining of the future motion of the ball, but it's powerless to cause the ball to start moving, let alone bringing the ball into existence. Without someone who acts as one coming from outside, the laws cannot do anything. The simple mathematical law, 1 + 1 = 2, has never caused anything to come into existence. The naturalistic view that clever mathematical laws in themselves had brought about life in the universe is actually fiction. Even if it was possible, the question where these creating laws came from without being created themselves are yet to be answered. Any detective that comes across a few objects in a room where people thought there is nothing will be ridiculed if he says that the mass of energy of particles that existed and were in balance for no reason became so unstable that it exploded, and during the explosion put their own laws in place, and that it has caused the objects in a room to come into existence. But that's a basic explanation of atheist naturalism. It is clear that someone has put the objects in the room. In the case of the universe, the someone is called God by most people. The first law of thermodynamics say that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It means that either someone outside our visible reality must have established energy, or energy must have existed since eternity. The second law of thermodynamics teaches that usable energy degenerates into unusable energy, entropy, if you know that. And also that which is orderly increasingly degenerates into chaos. It makes it an easy choice between someone who created energy and energy that existed eternally, because if energy existed since eternity, all the energy has already degenerated into unusable energy, with the result that not only life, but also the universe would not have existed. I know nowadays the atheists talk of an open system and even multiverses just to get out of this problem. Albert Einstein made an interesting remark that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is its comprehensibility. According to him, one would expect that the world would have been chaotic, in no way understandable to our mind. The opposite is, however, true. Scientific work presuppose a high measure of orderly arrangement of the world. I can talk a lot about fine-tuning, I don't have the time, but the universe are so fine-tuned with all the forces. It is really a planned universe. If you want evidence, just start to read about all the different forces in the world. The strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, that. Just read about that. The relationship between them, how stars are important for life to be. The whole thing of entropy that we have talked about. The second law of thermodynamics. For the universe to still be able to exist, entropy had to be low. The chance that it just happened that it be as low as 1 out of 10 to the power of 123. That is to say, as 1 followed by 10 to the power of 23 noughts. to write this down is impossible. Because if one was able to write a note for every particle in the universe, there will be too few particles to deal with. It's just precisely worked out. If human beings had originated naturalistically, consisting of matter and nothing else, they don't have a reason to account for their behavior, and are actually not humans anymore. Not only won't there be a standard such as good, not a standard such as good or bad, right or wrong, punishment also won't make sense, because humans are only slaves of their nature, or as Richard Dawkins said, of their selfish genes, and acts as a result of physical-chemical processes. There would be no difference between killing a human being, an animal, a fish, a worm, a plant, or a bacterium, as all is but the end of a physical, biological process. So I want to say, an atheistic worldview dehumanizes man, reduces man to be an animal reacting on survival instinct, or even less, a slave of coincidence, mechanistic, physical processes. I'm ending with this. Atheism limits scientific investigation to the physical, observable, testable, and measurable, because from the start it rejects other reasonable explanations in advance, on a philosophical base, not on a scientific base. It is like investigating the rolling ball confined to the ball in motion, without, for example, looking at cause or purpose. When the world and the history and life of people are observed, faith in God makes more sense than any alternative explanation. As for the world, this would include things like its origin, fine-tuning, and the orderliness of the universe. Concerning humankind, one sees clues that indicate the existence of God in, for instance, the ethical and aesthetic aspects of humanity and man's relationship with God and his sense of eternity. It is reasonable to believe in God, as more than 90% of the world does. Thank you.
Reply to some of the comments about physics. We see the physics professor sitting there, and I'm sure that he will have a few words to say about that. What my interest in actually is that this room is packed. Whenever we announce a lecture on the origin of the Earth or a lecture on zoology, 25 people turn up. So I'm kind of intrigued by that. Gideon, what do you think we're doing wrong? Okay. I'll be blunt about atheism. Just let me define it. Disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. And the word atheism originates from the ancient Greek atheist, meaning without God. I'm an atheist, and I will tell you a little bit about why I'm an atheist as we go along. The first individuals to identify themselves using the word atheist lived around about the 18th century during the Age of Enlightenment. We've heard about the Age of Enlightenment already. This was an amazing time. The French Revolution, noted for its unprecedented atheism, witnessed the first major political movement in history to advocate the supremacy of human reason. I will come back to this issue of revolutions. Rationales for not believing in deities include arguments that there is a lack of empirical evidence, the rejection of concepts that cannot be falsified. And one can argue the other way that we've just heard. Now, to me, everyone is born an atheist until you're educated into a belief system. In my opinion, this is part of brainwashing.
same goes across the board in education, so let's just keep that in mind. Atheism is in the position in which everyone is born, and therefore it's been argued that the burden of proof lies not on the atheists to disprove the existence of God, but on the theists to provide a rationale for theism. However, all others have all disagreed with these views of being born in such a position, and I'm not going to go down that road a little further because there are shades of grey about this. Shades of grey, there are a range of phenomena atheists may counter, anything from the existence of a deity to the existence of a spiritual, supernatural, or transcendent concepts such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Theism. And I'm sorry that there are not more people from those backgrounds on this panel. And I'll come back to that also as I go along. Now, just for some facts, there are probably about 2 to 30% of people in the world that are atheists. Most of those low percentages are in Africa. 20% in Europe do not believe in any sort of spirit, God, or life force. 60% in my born country, my birth country in Holland. But there remains disagreement on how best to define and classify atheism across the board. As I said, everyone is born an atheist until you're educated into a belief system. Me too. I had no idea of God when I was born. And for the first 12 years of my life, I remained more or less in that mode, ranging from implicit at first to explicit 50 years on, 50 years later, and I would like to share that with you. Explicit atheism is a conscious belief, e.g. I have followed through, but it took me until about 40 or 50, when I was 40 or 50, so it was a long time. And how did I become an atheist? Actually, through education. Let me briefly tell you how that evolved and what scientific and social evidence I use today to justify that. I was brought up by two great parents who at the end of World War II had to restructure their lives. My mother spent 4 years in a Japanese concentration camp. Hard labor, lots of abuse. My father fought in the Fleet Air Arm, bombs and torpedoes. I think that the period that separated them for 5 years, with lots of horrific experiences, played a role in how they brought us up. I've got 3 siblings, vis-à-vis religion. By the end of the war, they were no longer believers. But I did not realize that until much later. But they decided not to interfere with our own experiences, my siblings and I, exploration or inductions or not, to the world of God or gods. Figure it out for yourself, that's what they told me. That was their motto. Of course, public schools in Holland in the 50s were already separated in the Constitution from any church interference, from any church teaching in schools. So for the first 12 years, I never went to church after my baptism. Then, at 12, I moved to a boarding school in Ireland. There, I was confronted for the first time to school prayers, biblical reading, church twice a week, and so forth. It was what you might call a revelation. In fact, it was a cultural shock. And reading the Bible in English was a big challenge. I stopped knowing English at that time. After 6 years of this, I went to university and never went back to church. But I did learn a great lesson. My school was a Quaker school. And I learned something about the democracy from the Quakers. If you've been to a Quaker school or a Quaker church, you'll know what I mean. They are very different from the domineering and authoritarian pastors. I ended my university degree in geology. And I then spent the next 10 years or so traveling through South America and North Africa. 2 major experiences changed my life. 2 major experiences changed my way of thinking about religion. And for the first time in my life, I experienced, as I went to South America, traveled the mountains, traveled across the places where the missionaries were doing their work, I experienced for the first time real inequality and poverty, wars, and several revolutions. From then on, I was unable to link my observations to the belief systems of especially Christians that I was taught at school. So that became my implicit atheist time. During that time as a geologist and scientist, I made more and more observations that led me finally to come to South Africa to study the oldest rocks on Earth. I'd heard about them. 3.5 billion years old. For those who don't know, billion, 3,500 million. 1,500 million years into the history of our planet. I'm not going to go into the facts. How do we know that? These are factual statements that we can verify in pretty good stuff in the laboratory. Now, in these rocks, when I arrived here, we discovered the earliest known fossils, the first microbes, the first signs of organic life in these rocks, and the first signs of organic life on this planet. 1,500 million years into its history, 3,500 million years old. Then I learned more about the archives of the history of our planet after that. Dinosaur fossils, aged between 265 million years ago, roamed across the Karoo and ruled the planet for almost 150 million years. These are numbers. These are factual numbers. If you drive to the Multino, if you drive to Multino, you'll discover for yourself the oldest evidence of flowering plants co-evolving already at that time with insects, the first insects on our planet. It's a wonderful rock layer full of paleo life, and so forth. In the Karoo, a period of the first evidence of primitive coelacanth fish, followed in time by reptiles, 300 million years ago. And then you walk along the coast between Port Elizabeth and Bredasdorp. And what unfolds for you in the rock archives in many of the caves along this path is the complex history of the first humans, Homo sapiens, your ancestors, started about 100,000 years ago. This is 1/10 of a million years now. We're in a different ballpark here. And these humans walked across Africa to the north and started to colonize the rest of the world 70,000 years ago. You came back. Some of the white people here came back. Some of the black people, as our ancestors, walked into the rest of the world and colonized the rest of the world. Think about a little bit about that, because everybody who came back here was actually part of your ancestors. And at one stage, somewhere in Mesopotamia, these people that left Africa started agriculture, started farming. These were 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. These farmers evidently wanted to celebrate good harvests, and eventually this led to spiritual thank yous. The first type of churches were established, etc. Centers for coming together to pray, invented spirits. The rest is history, but history that's only recorded on paper, and with letters that came about much later. So the stories developed into some magical fairy tales that started with these farmers, eventually ending up as Genesis. And I want to now move into this part of the Bible that we've been hearing about, and I think about, how I think about Genesis, written in different ways, in different parts. For example, Genesis J, P, and E, etc. In the north of what now is Israel and the south of Israel. The story of Genesis became a basis of your religion. Now, to me, the story makes no sense scientifically. For example, I want to give you 2 or 3 examples before I finish this. Much more simple examples that you hear all the time from religious defenders about the origin of the universe. This is a very much more simple thing. Day 1, Genesis 1:1, 2.3. Light or day, is separated from darkness or night. We have an evening and a morning pass by, though the sun and the moon are not yet created, nor saw it ground to be a revolving earth. That would be the first thing that some scientists would think about. Hey, how can you have day and night when we're not revolving yet? Day 2, an expanse of barrier, a firmament is made to separate and hold apart the waters above and the waters below. Another evening and a morning pass. So we've got the oceans. Day 3, God separates the waters below from the dry land. The waters above are still in place, and somewhere above the firmament. In other words, we now have continents and oceans. On the same day, God commands the land to produce vegetation, including both seed-bearing trees and plants. What a great time. But the sun is not yet there to create it for photosynthesis. Most biologists would say, hey, how does that work? Now, there's a very simple set of scientific questions that one would want to ask after another evening and morning has passes. Then day 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars are created another evening. In other words, we have all this photosynthesis and trees and plants and circulations without the moon and the sun, etc. So these are some very basic questions that I was confronted with when I started science. My ball of wood. So, these are not the most difficult questions to answer. We've all been through this period of time in Earth history that we have revolutions. When the scientists make an observation, things change. Copernicus was one of them. Newton was another one. Einstein was another one. Feynman was another one. We see changes in the way that we can explain, or we do explain, scientists do, and we go back to the laboratory and test this. Because that's a fundamental issue of science. It's not, hey, maybe or maybe not. It is, can we test it? And that is what the physicists, and particularly in NMU here, are doing, scientifically testing what is the age of a fossil, what is the way that the atom works. Not, hey, it isn't working. Because as soon as we say that to a physicist, who say, well, you know, you've got it wrong, they'll run back to the laboratory and do the experiments until they find the answer. And they may have been wrong, but they find a new answer, and in science we move on. And that is an example for scientists, young scientists, to remember. And I'll take one example. Up to about a month ago, we thought that Homo sapiens started in southern Africa 120,000 years ago and then moved to the coast. 2 weeks ago, new genetic work has shown that in fact Homo sapiens were older than that. They were more than 260,000 years ago. And in fact, the latest genetics shows that Homo sapiens, the earliest Homo sapiens may actually have been in Morocco. Now there's a lot of debate about that. First time when you read this in a scientific journal, you say, no, it can't be true. And then the scientists go back, and I'm going to test it. And so we move forward. And so we build a better world. That is where the science comes in. And it's certainly not compatible with religion as we know it now. The timing is wrong, the stories are all mixed up, and we are... yes, okay. And I'm therefore a conscious atheist now, and the science moves on relentlessly. So, what I find interesting in my experience here in the last few years in the Eastern Cape is that there are some stories in the Eastern Cape before 1830s, before the Christians came in, and started taking over. And that to me is what I hope some of the students will think about a little bit more in depth. What I find the greatest colonization of this Eastern Cape and all of Africa as a whole is the Bible and the Quran. And if you read some of the spiritual stories of the Eastern Cape before Christianity comes in, they have a very different story to tell. A very much more exciting story. And if you read some of these stories, let's say in a book called Indaba, My Children, or some of Ben Okri's story, these are spiritual stories. They get much closer to the sort of stories that the Dar es Salaam is trying to tell us. The way that, and that's how I'm an atheist, you're going to die, there's nothing left. When I die, I will just disintegrate. And there will just be bits of chemistry that will start to take place in a different chemical reaction, and you will end up, maybe some of your chemicals will end up in a plant, some in a fly, some in a rock. And that is how nature works. That's my case. Thank you.
Phase of the debate that deals with these specialist rebuting some of the arguments that we've been getting tonight. Richard, I'm going to give you an opportunity to start. You can do it at the table, that's fine.
Thank Thank you, all gentlemen, for all of your contributions. Martin, I especially appreciate your passion for science and what it can do for the flourishing of human beings. You made a comment about testing in science. You ended with the comment that when we die, that's it. I'd like to know how you test that claim.
Ways of testing that, of course. There are other people who have died, and I can see what's happened chemically with them. And so I would assume that exactly the same would happen to me. We've got good
I don't understand how the fact that you've observed something second person about their chemistry enables you to conclude something first person about their consciousness. I just didn't follow your answer.
Before we go on, can you define consciousness?
Probably not.
Okay, thank you.
The fact that I can't define consciousness, give me a chance to think about it. Maybe I can come up with a definition in time. But I'm working with the assumption that all of us here are conscious and have self-awareness and rationality, intention, memory, these kind of things. So I was just curious as to how you would be able to test the fact that after a person physically dies, that is the case, that there's not a continuation of consciousness in any of those rudimentary sense of intention, memory, self-awareness, these kind of things. That was all.
Well, I think, is this working? I think that the scientists are making amazing strides today in terms of understanding how the brain works and how consciousness arises from that very complex set of reactions of electrons and chemical reactions. The science in that is moving extremely rapidly, both in terms of physics and chemistry, but also by the medical people. And when we read yesterday about two people that died in the Alps 75 years ago, and that were only found yesterday or the day before yesterday, you can go there and you can see in their brain there is no more reaction. There is no consciousness. So we can do these tests.
Thank you.
Who's next?
Who's next?
This one working.
This one looks better. The cutlass looks better. Yeah.
This is for a rock star. Well, I must say, both my colleagues who defended theism make the same mistake that Kant tackled in the Critique of Pure Reason. You should read that. I mean, you've obviously read it.
Yes.
The Critique of Pure Reason. I don't know whether you've read it. Well, then you will remember that the biggest mistake we can make from the point of view of knowledge and jump from there to the conclusion that what we believe in can actually be given the name knowledge is to assume that many of the things we observe in the world can be attributed to the presence of God. Case in point, Professor Howe. That was a lovely example you gave from Aquinas, and that you linked with the analogy of music, that you only experience music while it is occurring. You may recall that in the 18th century, Bishop Berkeley gave the same sort of explanation as a subjective idealist to prove the existence of God. And he's known, as some of you may know, for the saying, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. And then people wanted to know, well, if to be is to be perceived, what happens while I'm asleep? Does the world disappear while I'm not perceiving the world? And his answer was, don't worry, while you're asleep, God is perceiving the world, and that's why the world is, being kept in being, as it were. Well, that is a jump from, that's an anthropomorphic projection, what we would call anthropomorphic projection in philosophy. Because we are jumping from the experience of something that we are, of the existence of which we are sure of while we are perceiving it, to the analogous assumption that there must be a divine mind perceiving the world, explaining the sustained being of the world. Now that is an illegitimate logical jump. Then to my colleague from Northwest University, I want to say, it's not quite accurate as far as I remember to say that the writers of the Gospels were witnesses to Jesus' life. The Gospels were only written about 40 years after Jesus' death, not by people who knew Jesus. And also, it's easy to understand why the Gospels received such, why the historical ground for the message of the Gospels was so fertile. Those of you who know anything about the Hellenistic age around the time of Jesus' life will know that at that time, every Tom, Dick, and Harry proclaimed themselves to be God. Behind every bush you found a God. And it was part and parcel of the era. It just so happens that one of those sects of the time, the Christian sect, happened to become a major religion. And it's also been called the biggest hoax in the history of the world, with which I agree. What you also didn't tell us is that there's you may know about the work that's come out of the exegesis and the interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered at Qumran around 1945. Now, an international team of theologians have been working on that for a long time. And it became clear probably about 2 decades ago that all is not as it seems there. And several books have been written by people who have participated in the exegesis of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the most notable one is, the most notable theologian from that group is an Australian theologian called Barbara Thiering. And I would recommend to everyone here who thinks that they are Christians to go and read Barbara Thiering's book, Jesus the Man. Because what they discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, first there were copies of the Gospels as we know them. And then there were other scrolls that gave her and others a key to the interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And she used that, it's called the Pesha Code, and she used that to interpret the Dead Sea Scrolls and to show that it's written at 2 levels. One level describes the life of Jesus, the other level describes the life of Jesus after his so-called crucifixion, that he was married to Mary Magdalene, that he had children and everything. And one of the most important things, the so-called Jesus, the Son of God, was part and parcel of the Qumran titles that they gave to people in the community. The person who led the community was called God, and the one who was his second in command was called the Son of God. Jesus' brother James led them. He was called God, and Jesus was called the Son of God. The virgin birth was simply the name given to the occurrence of a woman who is betrothed but not yet married, giving birth to a child. During the time before the marriage, once they are engaged or betrothed, they were called virgins. And if during that time she has a child, it's called a virgin birth. Now, with the aid of the Pesha, all these things that have become the articles of faith of Christianity have been exposed. But we don't say anything of that. I'd like to know why not.
I appreciate several references to Kant. I remember in a class in seminary, my professor walked in. Imagine a room not unlike this one, not quite as big, but elevated, about 60 men and women. Seminary, conservative Christianity, and the professor walked in and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Immanuel Kant has influenced your life more than Jesus Christ." And I said, I've got to hear this lecture. You know? So I appreciate that. Problem, though, let me just, a couple of things about Kant, but let me first address your comment about Berkeley. Berkeley is responding to what he sees as a bankruptcy in Locke's epistemological dualism. So already in Locke, you have this understanding of how the knower relates to the known that's already set the table for Berkeley to just observe, I can do everything you do, Locke, respecting your statements about objects by merely stating it in the categories of perceptions and drop off the idea of substance. And I can do this without there being substances of which these properties obtain, which Locke was positing. Hume comes along and does the same move on Berkeley that Berkeley does on Locke. It says, just as you've shown Locke doesn't need substance and I can describe objects exclusively in terms of perceptions, Hume says, I can describe things without even perceptions, just in terms of phenomena without minds, without perceivers. I would submit to you all of that, as interesting as it is, and it gets even more interesting as you follow the drama from Locke to Berkeley to Hume and then to Kant and then subsequent, is that all of this is entirely detached from the classical tradition of Aristotle. Because Aristotle did have a totally different way of framing the issue of how human beings know the external world. An illustration I use with my students is sort of like the difference between an engineer and a reverse engineer. An engineer is a person who sees a problem. He garners his resources and efforts to solve that problem. A reverse engineer starts with the solution and works backwards to how is it that this solution works. Not whether the solution works, but how is it that the thing I already know is the solution works. So if you compare that to how we know reality, modern and contemporary philosophy is languishing under the burden of trying to solve questions like the problem of induction, the mind-body problem. How do we know there's an external world out there? And I would submit to you that a lot of these problems arose in Western civilization, particularly philosophical thought, precisely because it had amputated itself from ancient Greek thought in Aristotle. Because Aristotle wouldn't have tried to ask the question, well, gee, how do I know whether there's a world out there that's external to me? As Locke found himself eventually unable to answer, because he made a distinction between me as the knower and the thing that I know, and said, all I really know are just the images in my mind. I don't know the thing in and of itself. And Aristotle would say, first of all, I start with that. That's not even a philosophical question. I was dismayed at how many young people went to see The Matrix and thought they were doing philosophy. And thought that The Matrix was actually a philosophical question. Because Aristotle starts with the fact that I have no question that I know reality. The challenge is, what's the best accounting for that? What I would submit to you, just for your investigation and research, is the way Aristotle does that, and how he tries to answer the Greek skeptics like Heraclitus, or the monists like Parmenides, and the model that he sets up, and how that model is massaged through history and finds its zenith in Thomas Aquinas. I think interesting, answers a lot of the problems of modern and contemporary thought long before the problems ever came up. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Kant ever read a page of Aristotle. You made the comment that he's read all of these arguments for God's existence. I don't see any evidence whatsoever that he has the slightest familiarity with Aquinas' cosmological argument. I'm not suggesting that, gee, if he only did, he would have become a Thomist. But I am saying that all that Kant really knew was, I think, largely the philosophy of Christian Wolff. And so he does things like makes these judgments about the boundaries of human knowing cannot go beyond the empirical. Yet he gives these philosophical evidence to try to show that that's the case. So I would submit to you that Kant doesn't really pose the challenge to us that perhaps some people may think. Last point, and then I want to give it to Dr. Stojka. I find these things that you were saying about Jesus and virgin birth and these kind of things very fascinating. And I would love some resources from you afterwards. You can email me a bibliography. But I'd also like to suggest to you some alternative readings as well. There are people that have tried to take on these things and decide whether or not these things prove what they seem to say that they prove. Things like Jesus was married, for example. That a lot of that comes out of the much later Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter and these kind of things, which are much later documents. I'm not suggesting because they're much later they're likely to be false. I'm just saying there's an argument to be made as to how obvious it is that these facts are the way they are. I think it's a lot more complex than that. So before you make your final decision, and you've read Bert's suggested resources, I'd like maybe you to read some of my suggested resources to see how you would adjudicate the debate.
I think I will start with the Qumran and then come back to your other remarks about the New Testament writers. If I can start with the Qumran, point one, I don't have everything here that I should have had if I knew this was going to be the question. But I visited Qumran myself several times, and I visited also the place in Jerusalem where they have those scripts, and I've discussed lengthily with different people about the whole thing. And if you go to the Essenes at the way that they are doing their things, you're quite right. They were a sect. They were in the time of Jesus. They were there near the Jordan. But what they were is they were a typical sect. There is a story that perhaps John the Baptist came by and talked to them. There's a lot of those stories. But this latest things that you are talking of, most scientists that I've talked to there is not in agreement with your source. And that's why I think Dr. Howe is actually right. Go and do some more research on that, because that's not what I found personally. I don't have now all the data with me, unfortunately. If I knew the question, I would have come prepared on that. But please, you have the internet. Go on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Go to Quran. Go to the Essenes in Afrikaans, Essenes, whatever. Go and see for yourself what is really taught. What's wonderful is we got the whole Isaiah book there. We got a lot of proof for the Old Testament manuscripts there that was used in that time. And that's a wonderful thing. It's the same that is still being used by us as theologians. But on these other issues, there's really debates, and as I said, that is not so powerful as people will think it is. If I can come back to Jesus' life and when it was written, the problem with old manuscripts is it was written on papyri. It was time of persecution. You know, Christians were persecution for most of the first 300 years. Actually, a lot of them were slaves. It was not an easy time. And still, they wrote the New Testament, if I talk now of the New Testament, in such a way that they made certain that they copied as good as possible. And that's why we have different traditions. One of the theological subjects is textual criticism, to make sure that what we have is the original. And a wonderful thing is just now, one of our students are doing his PhD on a part of the Gospel of John that was written 20 years or less after the death of Jesus, not 40 years or more. That's very, very close. And it gave all the basic things, even the word Son of God. And when you see the whole thing of Son of Man, Son of God, you must go back to the Old Testament. You will find it there also, how to understand that and how it must be interpreted. So it's not for coming from the Hellenistic period alone. There was a lot of emphasis on logos and that sort of thing. And Professor Berg will know that we use words that are common in those times. That's correct. But you must see what do they give to the meaning of the words, in what way they're using it. And then you will see it differentiates a lot from that of the Old Testament, the Hellenistic period. And there were some wonderful books written these past 5 years, actually focusing on that the whole thing that they said that Christianity actually came from the Hellenistic idea, that is not true. Using some words that people know, but that's not the background of that. I don't know if they, so I didn't not refer to that. Okay, and I also said it was written by people that knew Jesus or came out of the same time of that. And people that knew Jesus, for instance, Peter, he knew Jesus. And also some of the others from that time. If you read Luke, it started with, he was a medical doctor. He said he have done investigation to make sure that everything is precisely as it happened. And I can give you a lot of evidence why, if you have 4 different ways that the Gospels are presented, as we have in the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, why there is smaller differences? Because it was not a hoax, because it was people that really testify about what they saw and happened. On the basic things, it's all the same. But sometimes I will say there was 1 angel at the grave, and the other one will say there were 2 angels at the grave. But the one don't say there was only 1 angel. He just spoke about the angel that spoke. So we as the Christian theologians and other people working in this field have worked through these things to really see, can we honestly tell people, if you can die even for this faith. And we must know that okay, I don't want to go there, but the biggest of Christians that's really been what's that English? Persecuted, that's a word, for their faith. So that's why it's important for us as scientists working with that to make sure what we are saying.
Just a quick response. We can talk about Jesus for a long time. And Professor Stoker probably knows about the Jesus Seminar, which is a research group that brings together all the resources concerning research about who Jesus was historically. And there's no agreement among the participants in this seminar about who Jesus was. That's important to remember. And the other thing I think that we are leaving out of consideration talking about Jesus, I mean, Jesus was a man. And Jesus was an incredible man. Jesus was, I think, reading everything about his life, an enlightened person long before the Enlightenment. At the time when people in his sect rejected certain claims of women to equality, at the time when they didn't want to know anything about lepers, about people who were disabled and so on, Jesus welcomed them all. And he welcomed all races, Gentiles as well. And that made him revolutionary. But Jesus was a man. Tonight, the debate is really about God. Was Jesus God? Let me put this to you. At the council in Constantinople in the 6th century AD or CE, a council that was called to sort out what is apocryphal or heretical on the one hand, and what is canonical or acceptable on the other hand, conventionally acceptable for Christianity. At that time, the church only decided that Jesus should be regarded as God. Until then, everybody accepted that Jesus had been married, Jesus had children. One of the Gospels that you didn't mention was the Gospel of Mary. Mary wrote a Gospel. Have you ever seen the painting by Leonardo da Vinci of the Last Supper? look at it again carefully. You'll see that the person sitting on Jesus' left is a woman.
And I answer, you said one sentence, I will really use only 3 sentences. Point 1, the Jesus seminar is a very small group. Most theologians around the world are not part of them because they don't agree with them. And there's good reason for that. Constantinople, 600. If you know, the first synod, big synod, was in 300 and something at Nicaea. There they already talked about who Jesus is. And so that is 300 years before that. And the part of the Gospel of John that we know of is that part that emphasizes that Jesus is God, and that's 20 years after Jesus. And we're now busy with that research. You can look at it scientifically. You're more than welcome. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas and all these things, they are not part of the Bible for a very good reason. If you read, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, at the end, the last paragraph, go on the internet and read it. Peter said, after all these discussions, because it's typical Hellenistic sort of discussion, a book started 200 years later, people thought that I want to say something in the name of a disciple. Then he said, well, Peter said at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, after everything that we have discussed, it is quite certain, Jesus, that no woman can inherit the kingdom of God. That's how we end. And then Jesus say, and Peter say, for that reason, we must let Mary and the others go away. And Jesus answered, no, it's not necessary for Mary and the others to go away, because I'm going to change them into men.
I don't want that.
I will allow Dr. Hart to respond to this, and that will then finalize the rebuttal.
So don't miss the point that Professor Stork is making. That's the Gospel of Thomas that John Dominic Crossan, one of the main scholars of the Jesus Seminar, thinks is the most accurate depiction of Jesus than any of the canonical Gospels. And I don't think I've ever seen that last paragraph, that unless a woman becomes a man, she will in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven, ever touted among the Jesus Seminar crew for celebrating the Gospel of Thomas. But frankly, I do a whole presentation on Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which is what most of this stuff is, that got mixed into the popular conversation. All the stuff about Jesus being married and these things are all later developments. Doesn't make it false. I'm just saying these things come from sources that aren't nearly as close to the original sources as the canonical Gospels. And I think there's every reason to believe that Jesus wasn't married, and there's no reason to think there was historically. In fact, even Crossan himself of the Jesus Seminar said that Jesus wasn't married. I mean, he even thought that, if we're going to quote the Jesus Seminar there. So I think that's just Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code, and angels and demons kind of research. I'm not talking about Martin, I just meant those kind of things, how that gets introduced in the conversation. I wasn't talking about his research.
Gentlemen, we're now at the final stage of the debate. I would like you to present your closing remarks, and you can keep it short, please, because we've actually gone over time. And I would like to allow time for questions.
For obvious reasons, I never have trouble keeping something short. By the way, something I forgot to say at the very end. Another source I would commend to you is a source by a man named Larry Hurtado in his big magnum opus titled Lord Jesus Christ, where he goes into the evidence from the first century that the first generation of Jews who became Christians understood that Jesus was Yah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he shows you not only from the text of the New Testament, but other things regarding the physical way in which the manuscripts were written. So I would recommend that to you if you want a shortened version of Hurtado's Lord Jesus Christ, you might consider his public speech that he gave summarizing his research, published in a book titled How on Earth Did Jesus Become a God? So I would commend that to you. Let me say in closing, first of all, something I deliberately try not to say in openings, and that is how grateful I am to have been a part of this tonight, and how grateful I am to you for welcoming me as a foreigner into your country 4 times now. Maybe we shouldn't let that out. Maybe I've exhausted my indulgence here. How many times? Is that 4 times? Go get that now. So thank you so much for your hospitality. I want you to know that my friends and family in America who know that I get to come to South Africa are jealous of me, especially when I get to tell them about the people here and about the land and the beauty and such. So there's a lot of people in the United States that I know that are excited that I get to come, and I thank you for this. And I thank you, gentlemen, for letting me be a part of this in this interaction. I appreciate what all of you have to say. Now, RichardGHowe.com is my website. What I want to do is put together a bibliography and conspicuously put it somewhere on the my website about some of these things. And I would appreciate the agnostic and the atheist perhaps to provide a bibliography of what they think are salient sources for us to do further research, because obviously we can only scratch the surface here. So RichardGHowe.com, don't leave the G out. You can remember it easily because it stands for good looking. And all I can say is I've never said that when the audience didn't burst out laughing. I don't know what's so funny about my English. But anyway, thank you and God bless.
Yes, I'd like to reiterate the vote of thanks that Professor Howe has just uttered. It's indeed a privilege to take part in this historical occasion. I can't imagine this ever having taken place at UPE. It wasn't a question that was ever up for grabs. Anyway, in closing, let me say that despite the learned things that my learned colleagues, the 2 learned colleagues defending theism have said here, they've not convinced me for one bit. Firstly, the conversation shifted from God to Jesus to entirely different things. God is defined as infinite, eternal, omnipresent, omniscient. Jesus was a man. Jesus was an historical person, which is why so much evidence could be attached to the person of Jesus. But you still have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That brings me back to my argument. There's a big difference between belief in the sense of religious faith and knowledge. Sure, knowledge of Jesus abounds, although it's not undisputed, as you can already gather. There's a lot of disagreement about who Jesus was, what his claim to divine status was, and so on, what all the various synods and councils throughout history have decided. And even today there's no unanimity about Jesus, but Jesus is not the same as God. How many of you know the wonderful film made by, and hilarious, film made by the American comedian Bill Maher? I think that's how you pronounce it, like the Afrikaans Maher, but you spell it differently, M-A-H-E-R. It's called Religulous, and it stands, a conversation of religion is ridiculous. But he's an agnostic, and he's a very brave man. He confronts everyone from a group of bikers for God to a priest in front of the Vatican, and he actually manages to get the priest as far as agreeing with him that all this is a lot of bollocks, but he's got to do it for a living. But watch the movie and make up your own mind. It's entertaining and it is very thought-provoking, because although Mayer is very funny, he's a serious agnostic. He's trying to probe the question, why do people who have no knowledge of God, and can have no knowledge of God, because we are all spatio-temporal beings who come into being and die, and what access do we have to infinity at all, right? And he takes that very, very seriously. So I'd like to conclude my contribution to this debate by saying that I don't think any evidence brought forward here contradicts the claim that we can have no knowledge of God, that if you believe in God, you simply believe. Fortunately, Nietzsche once coined the phrase, said there are certain people who suffer from metaphysical anxiety, a claim later reiterated by the famous American philosopher Richard Rorty. Now, I'm lucky, I wasn't born with metaphysical anxiety. A lot of my colleagues in philosophy were also born with metaphysical anxiety. You know how many philosophers actually also have degrees in theology because their anxiety drove them to investigate this question of God even further? Well, fortunately, I don't have that. If you have that kind of metaphysical anxiety, that is probably why you believe, I would suggest. The wonderful writer Leonard Shlain, in his book on the alphabet versus the goddess, Leonard Shlain makes a statement, and this reflects what Paul Feyerabend, famous materialist philosopher of the 19th century, once said. Feyerabend said, theology is anthropology. In other words, you learn more about people in theology than about God. A lot of people think that theology is a science of God. Not so. Theology is a science of what people have said about God, because nobody has direct access to God. Okay? Xenophanes among the ancient Greeks, long before any systematic religious critique came into being, Xenophanes already said, it's not the gods that created people. People create gods. If sheep and cows could have gods, they would also look like them. Because you'll see that the Thracians' gods all have red hair, like they do. The Ethiopians' gods all look like them. The Aegeans' gods all look like them. In other words, God is an anthropomorphic projection of fear and desire. Fear of being punished and desire for an afterlife. I suggest you read that wonderful book by a Hellenistic writer called De Natura Rerum, The Nature of Things, by a guy called Lucretius. Lucretius says, why do people believe in gods? Because they're afraid that they'll be punished if they don't. And they also got the carrot of wanting some rewards in the hereafter. And he said, I don't bother myself with this, because only if you accept that there are no gods can you live a truly ethical life. Because if a person claims to live a moral, ethical life, and it's only because of they're afraid of the hereafter, it's not a very authentically moral life. It must be only because this is the life you have in which you have to be morally responsible. And it's in that sense the famous psychoanalytical thinker Jacques Lacan said an ethics can only be atheistic. And by that he meant if you truly have an ethics, you can't pass the buck to God. You must accept responsibility for your actions. Thank you.
I'm listening to what my fellow debaters are believing about fear and about reasons why people are religious or not. And some of that is true, I believe, because I believe there is something such as truth. And we can debate that also. But to go and say that the only real ethics is atheistic, that doesn't make sense, and I will tell you why. Perhaps I must start and say, yeah, you can create a God. The question is, why do you want to create a God? Is it only fear, or is it because in your heart you know it really makes sense to believe that nothing doesn't come from nothing? That there's something that is out there that is really so incredible that he could thought of everything that the scientists are busy with. My other friend also said about physics, and there's a physics professor here. I grew up in a physics house. My dad and my brother and all my sisters, they all have PhDs and working in that field. And I test this, what I've said, not only with them, but with other people, all A-degree researchers. Because it's important for me when I tell people about certain things, I must myself have that certainty. And when it's about certainty, there's a lot of things in the past that you cannot test in a laboratory. You cannot even test if this was Peter Retief's farm, as they told me. So there's a way that you must get evidence for things. And that's what we've talked tonight about. What is the evidence for matter, for time, for everything that started somewhere, that it really started? And then I've heard about the way people are using the Bible or referring to the Bible. And even scientists will know that in Genesis 1 said, God created the heaven and the earth. And from there he's using the water and the earth and everything. So he created it already. And everything that's part of that. But the first day he said, let there be light. And the question was asked, but what about sunlight? It was the fourth day, quite so. But even if I want, I can say, there can be light without heat. Touch your laptop screen. So there can be light without heat. But that's not the question. On the fourth day, the word in the Hebrew is not created from nothing. It's not bara. The word being used there is it came to the forefront. So, to say that was the first time the sun and the moon was there, if you go back to the very first verse that God created everything and then things happened, you're actually giving your way of a theological thinking. You're not busy with the text. Okay, but let me conclude. If there's no God, then what Hitler did was just a matter of opinion. You see, that's a big problem. If my morals, they say it must be atheistic, you know, really a lot of things had happened and still is happening today through atheistic people. A lot of things that we will say is bad. Why do we say it's bad? If most people say it's good, then it must be good, will people say. But is that so? If most people in Germany say kill the Jews, is that a good thing? Or is there a source of morality that we can look to? And if there's a source of morality, what is that? Is it the human heart? We saw what humans are doing, especially if nobody sees. So it cannot be the human heart. It cannot be the biggest group, because you have seen what mobs can do, and we will say that's wrong. So if most people decide something is right, it is not necessarily right. So what does that tell you? There must be a moral giver, a person who put it in our chemical things that's happening inside us to make us to even are willing to sacrifice. Because if it's only about survival of the fittest, there's nothing of a sacrifice. If you're stronger than me, I will be very supportive. If you're not stronger than me, I will get you down. That will be my morals. And to tell that atheists is the only people that really have morals, that is the basis of naturalism, of evolutionism, survival of the fittest. That's how we were created. Then our heroes must be guys such as Hitler and others in the history. Then they must be our heroes. And they're not. Because why? Because God made us a moral being. And we know there's something that is much more than the chemical things that die the moment I die. Something much more. Thank you.
Can I stay seated? Thank you. I'm not going to respond here. I'm going to say my own things. I will say what's the difference between science and philosophers. And I agree with much of what my colleague Bernard said about many of the aspects of what we know and what we don't know. But philosophers, and he is a philosopher, spend their time on maybe, maybe not. Maybe, maybe not. Let's have an argument about it. Scientists like to go into the lab and test things. I'm going to stick with these scientists. Copernicus did that, made major changes in our belief system. Einstein did this. And in the social sciences, and in social systems, and the social labs, we have the same sort of revolutionary, what we might call, the scientists call tipping points. Jesus Christ was an amazing revolutionary. So 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, Martin Luther King, should be celebrating him today, or this month. 100 years ago, Marx, and more recently, Che Guevara and Mandela. These were revolutionaries that made our thinking change across these tipping points, across these social systems that they were thinking about. So that's my one aspect of being an atheist, is this science does not fit the facts, so religion does not fit the scientific facts of evolution that we have developed, or scientists have developed, over the last 150 odd years. With accelerating speed since the discovery of genetics and so forth. I've mentioned that before. And I wanted to bring into that these other tipping points of amazing people that we've seen. And some of the tipping points are bigger than others. Jesus Christ's tipping point was huge, but no different than the hugeness of, perhaps not quite in the same league, Martin Luther King and Marx, and certainly Mandela in our recent times. So that's the one point, and talking about Mandela, the second point, that all I have seen around me when I've traveled around the world is destruction, hatred, intolerance of belief systems that do not fit their own. I'm not a person that says you can't believe. Everybody believes. I think that's fine. But we have to be tolerant about it. And I don't see that. I've been to Chile, where I see the missionaries and the Spanish colonists killing people, hundreds of people, millions of people. We've seen this in Ethiopia, we've seen this across Africa, in Congo, Uganda, South Africa. And then even in my own European Union, in Ireland, when we talked recently about the pastors and the the way that they have treated small little boys for many, 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 many years. Those are issues that I find extremely hard to say, well, okay, read the Bible and we'll fix it. It doesn't, to me, make sense. And that's where I can say to Bert, philosophers, maybe not, but there are some facts. And social scientists can fix some of these facts in the same way that scientists, natural scientists, are doing that. I would say to my continued quest is to better understand nature and how it works, how it's evolved, and how it might evolve into the future. We don't know that. Same things, we don't know about what's going to happen to you when you're dead. It's just very difficult for people to believe scientists that once you die, you dissolve back into the chemistry and physics of nature. I've mentioned this before, I'll rather re-mention that. And whether you're going to be a fly or whatever, that's immaterial. So I want to come back to two issues. One has to do with the colonization of Africa with the Bible. And the second, and that gets me into African philosophy. But before I do that, I say, this Bible to me, and the story that we've heard from my colleagues here, it's a great story that led to science knowledge of the time, but we've moved on since then. I mentioned Copernicus, etc. And the scientists certainly are not in agreement that there's only one universe. There's a lot of talk about that this is not the first universe. And so the science, as it moves on, as we learn more, will probably end up saying this was not the first universe. So watch this space. I will leave it at that. I would like to ask the audience here, can I see some hands of people that were brought up in the Eastern Cape? Wow, that's more than 50%. Now, in your ancestors, before they were taken over by the Christians, had amazing stories. And some of them were scientific thinking. And I want to give you one example. There's a little book that came out very recently by Sakes Mda. It's called Little Sons. And it's a story about a Xhosa guy, belongs to some sort of clan, and he meets a Khoisan woman, and he falls in love with her, which he is not allowed to do from his king. But they escape up the Drakensberg, and as they go up the Drakensberg, they look at the sun, and he learns that the Khoisan think that every time the sun disappears, a new one arrives the next day. There's a new sun every day. The book is called Little Sons, by the way. No, sister, says the Bantu guy, we know that believe there's only one sun. It goes down and it comes up again the next day on the other side. Well, they were asking a scientific question. How do they solve this? They were fighting about this, and I would like you, from those of you who come to Eastern Cape, this was a piece of science that was going on, a science question. How did they resolve this? They, of course, had their own belief systems. And what I find interesting is these Khoisan and Xhosa stories tell us something about their own spirituality, their own background, the way that they thought about, the way that you died and your ancestors and what you had to do to keep your ancestors happy. So all the things I don't know, I'm learning about it. Fascinating. Of course, there are many stories like this. That's what I think the Bible is too. It's a bunch of stories, just like we have some of these great writers here. Ben Okri, the Bamish Road from Nigeria, the Endawa My Children by Cretton Muta, and These Little Sons. These are amazing stories. So my hope is that we are going to have graduate students in this university, 50% of them that come from the Eastern Cape, take more, this is part of my history. This is actually a better story than the Bible story. This is a set of stories. This is a set of stories that we were led to believe by the Christians when they colonized us, and throw out these stories and read the Bible instead, have left us with a history that we're not aware of. And maybe these were better stories than what we read in the Bible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, Bert, Henk, and Martin, for your contributions, your very valuable contributions. And thank you, Martin, in particular, for laying bare your heart, and everybody else. I really do respect your time and your input, and for being honest. It's now time for, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. And I'd like you to please be brief and address your question to a particular specialist. There will be mics floating around on each side of the hall. Zola, if you could perhaps assist us on that side. And then whoever else, Zola, on the other side as well. I will be taking questions. Oh, there are lots of hands, so you'll have to assist me in managing this process. So I've got a question here in the front, and you will be second, sir, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, 9, 10, 11 at the back. So we've got 11 questions at the moment. Yeah, so please be brief and address your question to a particular person.
Thank you. My question actually goes to the gentleman who's talking about atheism. It's quite interesting to find that you're saying that there were Homo sapiens here in the Eastern Cape or here in South Africa so many million years ago, and that people who became colonizers were like coming back to their ancestors. Did you make any research as to whether there are other Homo sapiens in other parts of the world? One. Two, you seem to mixing in the Eastern Cape the
Sorry, might I ask that because of the number of questions,
Okay.
that you restrict yourselves to just one question, please?
Yeah, this is actually linked to this one. That you're mixing up mythology, theology, and spirituality. And you're thinking that religion only came when the colonizers came here. That is incorrect.
Thank you.
Well, that of course depends how you define what religion. Of course, there were religions in Ethiopia, for example, that came before most of the colonizers and the rest of Africa. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, I would say, I'm talking now about Islam and Christianity. Yes, they did not really arrive here until the time that the colonizers started moving in. And that's any time from the 1600s onwards. Of course, in the Eastern Cape, it was really rife from the early 1800s onwards. Your other question is not quite correct. It's not millions of years ago. It's about 120,000 years ago. So it's relatively recent in terms of Earth history. But yes, the new genetic data that scientists have come up with shows that the Khoisan in this part of the world have the largest genetic diversity than anywhere else in the world. And from that, and from the genetics that we have from the Europeans and the North Americans, it's quite clear that the ultimate derivation of Homo sapiens in America and in Europe, which basically did not arrive until about 50,000 years ago. So we're talking about almost 100,000 years earlier here in Southern Africa, that Homo sapiens was moving around, whatever they were doing. They were doing the same sort of things we do. They multiplied, so they must have had sex. And they must have eaten, and they must have found food. So, although they didn't read and write. But I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that the scientific evidence is very clear. Homo sapiens, your genetic genes go furthest back in Southern Africa than anywhere else in the world. This is where it started. Homo sapiens started. It is now clear that Homo sapiens lived almost in the same time as Naledi, the new hominin. It wasn't the Homo sapiens, but they were living together in the caves somewhere in Gauteng. And at some stage they moved to the southern coast, and we don't know why, and we don't know how. But that's part of science. We're moving on, we're making all sorts of new discoveries. But the bottom line is, your answer is yes, it started here. And from here, the rest of the Homo sapiens and the rest of the world were colonized from here.
Thank you, Martin.
My question is to Prof. Olivier. Earlier on when you began, you said that we cannot observe God in time, in space, and in matter. But if you can allow me to perhaps answer your question by referring to the contentious book which we call the Bible. In the very first chapter, where it begins by saying in the beginning, God created the earth and the heavens, which is time, space, and matter. In the beginning time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. So yes, as Christians, we do not suppose that the Bible is a textbook, is a scientific textbook, but however, it does answer complex scientific questions. Another example is for example, the hydrologic cycle, where the water comes down from Earth and it goes back into the clouds. Isaiah 55 talks about that as well. It says that the snow and the water waters the earth, and it does not return there without watering it, which explains the hydrologic cycle. Although it explains it in what Dr. Stoker would call bad English, because the Bible is written in human English. In plain, common human language. Sorry. Yeah. And my question to you is, you also said that we do not have enough faculties to understand an infinite God. But then my question to you is, what yardstick do we use to determine we have certain faculties to determine certain things? For example, do we have enough faculties to determine reality? Do we have enough faculties to determine that there's a table in front of me? Do we have enough faculties to determine that I'm speaking here and I'm alive? And then finally, to both of you, Dr. Olivier and Dr. Debate, my final question is, if Christianity, well, it's a hypothetical and unfair question, but if Christianity was proved to be true, would you believe it?
Is this working?
Yeah, it's working.
Firstly, when I said that God is not perceptible in space and time, I wasn't denying that space and time are given to us in what Kant called forms of intuition, which make them ideal forms. They are part and parcel of reason. If you doubt that, try and think outside of space and time. You can't. You can think everything out of space, imagine it's not there, but space will remain behind. The same is true of time. But when you think of God, God is not given to you in space and time, but the idea of God is given in space. And of course we can think that. But the world, the origin of the world as it is depicted in Genesis, which by the way is a myth. Genesis is a beautiful myth. There are many other creation myths all over in many countries, in many nations' histories. Genesis was a myth, and I think it's Aramaic, if I'm not mistaken, one of the Aramaic creation myths. And to see in Genesis, as you correctly say, a kind of an historical account is simply wrong. But put it this way, space and time, even though you try and link to God through creation, we don't need God as an hypothesis to explain space and time. Quite frankly, I don't think that we need any more than the theory of evolution to explain how and why we have living things in the earth. There's a new field of research that's been emerging for the last 10 or 20 years. It's called posthumanism. And in posthumanism, we see science, it's very interdisciplinary. Scientists, philosophers, biologists, artificial intelligence researchers, and so on, all come together there. And what they all agree is that humanism and anthropocentrism of the modern type, from approximately the 16th century onwards, was wrong in assuming that human beings, and Christianity assumes that too, is the center of everything. That we actually share intelligence across a broad spectrum. In fact, and here's the answer to where does life or where does everything come from. In biology, scientists have demonstrated that even the smallest life form has the intelligence to organize itself. We share intelligence with every living being, from the smallest through to artificial intelligence. We are not the only intelligent beings. And we don't need the hypothesis of God to explain what we have. And besides, even if we tried, we don't have the means. Those things that you mentioned, of course we have the faculties to perceive them, to argue about them. I'm not plagued by the analytical philosophy kind of question of does the external world exist. That's rubbish. I mean, Aristotle showed through his epistemology that we need not doubt that. And phenomenology, which is a far more recent development in philosophy, the father of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, actually went back to a term that Aristotle used to show how we make contact with things in our perception.
Thank you, Bert.
I hope I've answered your question.
Can I? Is there a question for Dr. Howe?
Yeah.
And for,
Can I just correct you slightly? It's not we're the only intelligent humans. It's animals. We're not the only intellectual animals, not humans. We're not the only ones with
thank you, Martin.
knowledge. You just mentioned it's human.
Just one sentence. Genesis at the start was not written in Aramaic. The newest things prove that it was Old Semitic language, basis of a Hebrew, and that the Hebrew grew out of that and the Aramaic grew later on. So that whole hypothesis changed. And all the words at Elba and other places in Syria, all those places that Genesis referred to are now found on tablets, more than 10,000 in a library. So Genesis is not a fable.
Thank you, Henk. There's a question for Dr. Howe.
There's a question here. To Professor Debate, you spoke of things like colonization and other bad things that are done by people who are supposedly Christian. I'd like to ask you this question. Is it fair to judge a philosophy based on its abuse?
The question is it fair to base a philosophy on its abuse?
Is it fair to judge a philosophy based on its abuse?
Is it fair to base philosophy on
To judge a philosophy based on its abuse?
I think I prefer if you would answer that yourself. I don't
There's another question. This gentleman with you could perhaps just speak up, please. It's difficult to get a mic to you now.
I guess I'm going to stand over here. I have a question for Professor Stoiber. You spoke a little bit about atheists, in a bad sense, regarding morals and stuff like that. I don't think that, morals I think it comes from within us, and I think that a simple way of looking at it is I treat others well simply because that's how I would like to be treated, not because I want to be rewarded in heaven or that kind of a thing. And I find that nowadays, if I say I'm an atheist, people tend to be offended in some kind of a sense, and I find it a bit strange because, I'm not necessarily offended when, when a religious person says, thank God. I see that's more or less the same thing. So it might be seen as religious intolerance when, in fact, I think it's the opposite, where, it's not like we've got nothing to live for. It's more that, we've got nothing to die for, in that sense. So when it comes to religious intolerance, we're atheists, we don't believe in the supernatural. We live in reality, and in reality we have real problems. And I think you find, you're forced to agree that the real problems we have now are in fact caused by religious intolerance, suffered by religious people. And I think we all know where that landed us up.
Thank you. I think that's really a fair question. So we agree that ethics comes from out of us. The reason for that we disagree with. If you believe in atheism, you probably believe that everything comes from chemical, physical things, that it went into biology, into the DNA and all that sort of things. So then you really have the problem to say, but what is good? You feel it in your heart, and I agree with you. But what really is good? How can you define good? And that's a big problem the atheists have at this stage. That's why the new atheists speak of selfish genes and that sort of thing. Actually, I'm just here because I want to survive. What you have put now is a next thing, and I agree with that. I want to help others. And that is not survival of the fittest. That is human beings. That's why we are created in a different way. That you say a religion is about rewarding in heaven, I agree with you. That's no religion. If you do anything so that you can have a place in heaven to God or a God or whatever, you're doing it for yourself. So it's self-focused. That's not doing it because you want to. And that's a big difference. That's why when Jesus Christ was on the earth, he spoke the strongest words against the Pharisees who said, I do everything so that I can gain a certain position or a relationship with God. Because he said, I want to give it to you 100%. And your reaction is because you are made new so that you can love your enemies even. And that's what Jesus told. And just for the sake of that, Africa, the biggest leader of Christianity for a long time was Augustine, and he was from Africa 300 and 400 from after Christ. But you see, so what is the basis of morals? What is good and what is bad? How do we see that? And we can speak of Christians that misuse it, and I say, yes, there. You're right. But I can tell you that the country where the Christians today are persecuted the most are an atheist country. That even if you open the Bible where anybody see it, you're dead. And that...
Thank you. Thank you, Henk.
Yeah.
There's a question, a gentleman here in the middle, and then Grant.
That's it, the mic.
Sorry, can we just get some quiet, please?
I have the mic here. Can I shoot?
Just a second. He's been having his hand up for a while. He was on before. In fact, I'll give you a chance this time. Thank you.
One of the issues, theories arising out of post-humanism would be the fact that one man's reality is not really another man's reality. It's kind of an existential thing. I think that we've shown by a simple experiment that we all experience things the same way. You can take a boiling kettle, pour it on somebody, and they will experience it the same way. No one is exempt from that throughout humanity, throughout time. And I'd just like to ask if there's any of the panelists, perhaps the gentleman on the right, if you could explain to us how evolutionists came to the leap of faith that brings us from the known principle of biogenesis to abiogenesis, where an incredibly complex living cell arose out of dead matter, which mathematically has already been shown to be impossible. To say that the mechanisms driving evolution have shown to be defective and they do not work. And how, for instance, does a reptilian lung turn to an alien lung over time without the organism dying because it doesn't actually function?
Thank you, sir, for that interesting question. Richard, the question is addressed to you. Right. Richard.
I was pretty happy not getting any questions there, Paul. I'm just about to win my solitaire game. Can I go ahead and finish? Okay, I'm not sure why this question was directed to me. I think I agree. I hear with an accent, first of all, so I might have misunderstood you. And I also I'm slightly hearing impaired, and I don't have my hearing aids with me because they actually broke. So if I didn't understand your question, I would agree with you that the mechanisms of Darwinism don't seem to be able to give rise to things that we know to be true about biological life. The problem is, I'm not even a secondary source on most of this. I'm a tertiary source. I'm not a scientist, so I just have to defer to the dispute that scientists may have. I would suggest there is well, maybe this would be something I'll put in the bibliography of some stuff of scientists that I know who would more or less concur with what I think the thesis of your question was. So am I just totally...
The theory of evolution is what is driving secular humanism this time, this day. And it's not always been so, secular humanism. So what I'm saying is that the evolution debate is central to this as well.
Yeah, I don't think so, because there are Christians who hold to the theory of evolution, theistic evolutionists, for example. And there are Christians who repudiate evolution 100%. So the question about the truth or falsity of Christianity sometimes can get obscured in disputes about more remote questions, like whether Genesis is, how do we have a, light without a sun? Those things those are interesting, but that doesn't really seem to impinge on the direct question about the kernel of the Christian faith and whether it's true or false. And I started out by saying, I think the professor here agrees with me, that the question of God really is central because it's antecedent to questions about Christianity. And I concur with the sentiment of the question that said you can't judge a system by its abuses. So there's a difference between Christians and Christianity. And I agree with that. So I would suggest one reading to you that comes to mind. There's a book by a philosopher named Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R. It looks like Fesser, but it's Phaser, like in Star Trek. A book titled The Last Superstition. What he tries to argue, and he's sort of directing the book to the Richard Dawkins scientism of the new atheism, which isn't necessarily shared by everybody on the panel, perhaps, or in the audience. But nevertheless, that's the focus of his book. What he tries to show in that book is there are many things, commitments intellectually, categories, data, that are integral to the very existence of the natural sciences, that are themselves the very ingredients that compose the classical cosmological argument for God's existence. So science can't give you logic, it depends on logic. Science can't give you universals, it depends on, we've been talking about humanity. The Nuremberg trials, when the defendants of the Nuremberg trials were brought up before the justices were from the Soviet Union, France, UK, and the United States, but they couldn't try them on the basis of the laws of those nations because they weren't citizens. They couldn't try them on the basis of the laws of Germany because they didn't break any laws in Germany with the final solution to the Jewish question. So how did they try the defendants in the Nuremberg trials? They tried them on the basis, using a phrase that we still use today, crimes against humanity. I ask my students, what is a humanity? Is it real or is it not real? If it's not real, how can you commit a crime against it? If it is real, in any sense of the term real, I submit to you, you're going to either be some form of Plato or some form of Aristotle. Either of which will begin to give you the philosophical ingredients that out of which arise the classical arguments for the existence of God, which you rarely find in the common dispute. Most of the things and most of the atheists that I'm familiar with, I teach a class on contemporary atheism to doctoral students, and we read the primary sources, and I'm flummoxed as to how many contemporary atheists in philosophy seem to show very little to almost no acquaintance with the classical arguments for the existence of God. I'm not suggesting, if they only read the classical arguments, then they'd all become theists. But I think that this classical model almost never gets on to into the conversation. One last source. I would commend to your reading Jay Budziszewski's book, Don't Ask Me to Spell Budziszewski. And don't ask me what the J stands for, because I asked him that once, and he didn't like it, apparently. No, I'm kidding. Jay Budziszewski's book is titled Written on the Heart, The Case for Natural Law. My take on morality would probably be slightly oblique from the others here, in terms of what is good and what is human morality, these kind of things. But I would just submit that for your consideration to think what that natural law theory, which has sort of fallen by the wayside and isn't discussed, especially among Protestants, because it smells Catholic to them. So Protestants break out in a rash when somebody starts talking natural law theory. Jay Budziszewski's Written on the Heart, The Case for Natural Law, as another alternative to how we understand morality, and eventually how we understand morality vis-a-vis the existence of God.
So what you're saying is that science is not
Come on, sir.
Yeah, you can continue, and then after that it's granted you.
Firstly, I want to thank you, Mr. Yvette and Mr. Olivier, for sharing here. You two seem to be people with tremendous amount of faith. I think disbelief in God really takes a lot of faith to believe that God exists. I just want to say, keep it up. Keep up that good faith. The second thing is, to you, Mr. Olivier, for external evidence outside the Christian faith for the validity of the gospel, I would suggest that you read Josephus. Josephus is one of the historians, a Hebrew historian, who actually is outside the Christian faith, who validates the validity of the gospel. So check him out. I don't know your sources, but they don't seem to really line up. But look out Josephus. He's one of the very reliable historians. Mr. Debate, my wife is Dutch. It's a pleasure to meet a disciple of Richard Dawkins, and it's wonderful. I want to say, you said something about lack of empirical evidence for the existence of God. And you said that you became an atheist because of your education, hence your unbelief in the existence of God. My question is this: what is it about your education that has caused you to dismiss the idea of there being a creator God? Would you please be kind to describe to me the God you don't believe exists? That question first, and then I have another one. Is that okay?
Good enough stuff. One of you. I'll keep an eye.
I have to correct you on your use of words. I can't speak for my colleague Martin over there, but as for myself, I don't have faith, except in the ordinary, everyday sense of having faith in your fellow human being, something like that. But the kind of faith that you're trying to foist on me, it's not faith. It's belief. There's a difference between faith and belief. If somebody says to me, that person is a thief, I will believe it when I have evidence for it. Okay? That kind of belief I have, in an empirical sense, in a rational sense, and so on. But don't tell me I've got faith, because well, at least not in a religious sense, because I don't believe I actually have the knowledge to say that I have faith. If you want my honest opinion about what I would call God, or what I would call divine, in the 17th, 18th century, there was a philosopher called Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish guy, who wrote a wonderful, well, several books, but in one of his books, he says what Descartes and all the other people who had been taking part in this debate about substance and attribute and modes and so on, called God, is simply nature. I agree with him. He's known as a panentheist. Not a pantheist, a panentheist. Nature understood as something endlessly creative, but also, and this is the important part, more than what it is at any given time. In other words, there's a bit of Aristotle here too. Nature always has the potential for more than it is at this time. And I hope to heavens that is true, because given what human beings, the so-called crown of creation, has done to Mother Nature, it'll be a miracle if our species survives another 100 years.
Go on.
He hasn't answered my question. I asked him a question to describe
sorry.
Why don't believe?
Yeah, I'll ask him. I know Richard Dawkins quite well, actually. So his book, God Delusion, I read it, but I couldn't finish it, because I think the one thing that Richard Dawkins does, he makes you feel inferior. He is very harsh. He says, well, if you're not a believer, you really aren't in this world. And he does exactly the same thing, what I think Christians do, in the sense of when they came into Africa. You don't believe the Christian church? I'll cut your head off. Or I will put you in jail. In a sense, Richard Dawkins comes through, if you don't believe in his science, if you don't believe in his evolution, I'll cut your head off. You're no good. And so I think we need to find a common ground. Let people believe what they want to believe, that's fine. But let people also look at the scientific facts. And if he'd stuck to that, just like Darwin did, he said, these are the facts. Doesn't it look like we have evolution? And Richard Dawkins had taken that much further in his science, and he said, look, Darwin was right. We are moving in the right direction. But he took halfway that book and said, well, if you don't believe it, you shouldn't be part of this university, for example, when he was in Oxford. So I agree with his science, but I don't agree with the way that he believes. We must all believe in that science, otherwise we're all going to be no good.
Thank you, Martin.
My other question, I think question was...
Sorry, may I ask that we keep the questions short?
Which God? Which God I'm talking about?
Martin?
I'm talking about any God. I don't believe in any God. There is no such thing.
I think for me, the God that...
Sorry guys, I need to call you to order, please. There are many people that would like to ask questions. Please keep your question concise, short, and the answers equally short, please. Thank you very much. Grant?
Prof, honestly, you said Jesus was an incredible man. Why did you say that? Because Jesus came to be God, so why would he claim that? What type of incredible man would be a liar? Either he is a lunatic who thought he was God, or he is a liar, or he knew he was lying, or he was Lord. You decide. Prof. Debate, this is just a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer this. If we are just a random mix of atoms, as you're implying with the consciousness argument, how do you know that your arguments make sense? Secondly, you also imply that you can judge a philosophy by its abuse. Have you considered that more people died under atheistic Stalinism than under Hitler? There is no objective moral values if you take God out of the picture.
Thank you.
The reason why I said that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was a wonderful man was, I've already mentioned some of them, because he was revolutionary in his thinking and in his acting. But more than that, you should read a book by Leonard Schlein called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, in which he has a chapter on Jesus where he contrasts the actions of the church that came up after Jesus' death. And he shows how different the church is from the teachings of Jesus. For one thing, the church is entirely patriarchal. We talk about the Son of Man, we talk about mankind, and yet Jesus was always kindness itself towards women in the Gospels that I know. So Jesus was by all accounts a wonderful man, but again, the difference between the historical Jesus and if you read the Gospels without looking at what the churches that came up, to the Christian churches that rose up after his death teach, you'll find quite a big difference.
Thanks, Brad. It's really difficult to manage all these. There's such a demand for questions. So, gentlemen, you next, and then I'm going to allow 5 more questions. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be able. We'll be sitting here. Okay, let me just ask this quickly. Are you happy to continue for another 3/4 of an hour? Yes. Gentlemen, specialists, are you happy to continue? Okay. Right, so then we can work through the questions systematically. Those people that would like to leave, you're welcome to leave. Gentlemen, proceed with your question, please.
Thank you very much. Mine is first.
Sorry, if you do decide to leave, please just do so very quietly.
Prof. Debate, you seem to be contradicting yourself. You say when we die, we are nothing. But you still speak on ancestry. And the people who believe in ancestry believe that their ancestors are living after them. And you actually said that people who believe in ancestry want to make the ancestors happy. That's what you word. So you are contradicting yourself. You don't have to answer me. And then, Prof. Olivier, if you could be put into a court of law, remember in a court of law, in the court there's a judge, there's a prosecutor. Yes, you'd be a witness. There is a book there people swear on the truth. You have so many references. They are confusing. If I was your student, I would be confused. What would you swear on? Which book would you use to swear on? Which name would you use? Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just answer that? Excuse me, can I just answer that? I think you're confusing yourself.
Sorry, can you please just quiet down?
I didn't say what you have just said. I did not say that I did say that as we die, we just become chemicals. But I didn't say that I believed what the Khoisan or the San or the Bantu people believe in terms of their spirituality. I'm interested in the stories. I didn't say, so I'm not contradicting myself. I don't believe them because I don't understand them. And maybe when I understand them, I will get a great story out of it.
Why are you using them to support your argument?
Pardon?
Why are you using them to support your argument if you don't believe them?
So the question, Martin, is why do you use those stories to support your argument?
I didn't use them to support my argument.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. The next question. Casper?
I think I owe this gentleman
Casper, it's fine. You can just talk.
Andre, I think I owe this gentleman an answer. What book would I swear on?
Yes.
I don't think you need to swear on any book. If there's something I believe in, it's the critical intellect. The one thing, Theodor Adorno, famous Jewish German philosopher, once said, if there's one thing that nobody can crush, and he was referring to the Nazis, it's the critical intellect. I fully agree. We are thinking beings. I'm a philosopher. I relish thinking.
My question you didn't answer the question.
So hold it close to you.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm intrigued that you, on your insistence on drumming up evidence for the existence of God, even though, as Kierkegaard pointed out, faith is a leap into the dark. I submit to you that your argument is circular. You're attempting to prove something which is not openly proved. And although you claim to be a Christian, you speak with the tongue of an agnostic.
Casper, are you addressing the question to Richard? Richard?
You speak of my tongue and how I do it, and faith is a leap into the dark. In ethics, we say when we weigh some things, we look at the motive and the aim and the mean and the end of the whole thing. So you're now at one of the most difficult parts. What is my motive? And I'm actually agnostic because I want to refer to evidence through that. If I understand your questions correct. But I'll go to try to answer. I've heard the difference between faith and belief. I focused on what they believe. And you believe what you have said just now, I hope. So that means all of us work from belief. Even if I'm working in a hospital and I must see what the temperature of this first patient is, I believe this thing is going to tell me because of a lot of reasons. There's evidence in the past that can tell me a lot of things. So science is a wonderful thing. Science actually is telling me how precisely this whole universe were created. And that's because I'm looking at the same facts. And, well, we can talk about a lot of scientists that were Christians, that were atheists, that was agnostics coming from other faiths. But all of them looked at those facts. So the newest thing is about DNA. Now, I don't know a lot about DNA, but I'm listening, perhaps the same as you, to what people are telling about that. And once one of the most famous professors, he's also A-level researcher of Stellenbosch, he said that DNA made evolution impossible. And his reason is because then new information must be added. You have the 4 things that you can twist as you want to in the DNA, but to have new chapters put into that, information must be put in. So in short, if I have ink and I put ink on a paper, that can be just a blob, or it can be a writing. If you see ink on a paper, just a blob, you will say, well, what happened there? But if you see the ink, something that somebody had written, you will say, oh, there's information. And DNA was made in a way that information was put into that. So that is evidence. If my evidence is correct, that's what we must debate. And that's what we're busy with. We're looking at different evidence, and we say we believe this, bring me to this conclusion or to that conclusion. So actually we're busy with a scientific process because science is not only laboratory. Most science, if you must decide between economics, must you work more in a capitalistic or more in communistic or in what way, you look at different evidence and what is the result, but also what is the aim and what is the method being used. And you weigh all these sort of things. So we're busy with what we believe, and we give reasons for what we believe. And that's how I think God made us.
Thanks, Ian.
Good evening. My question is to Martin Davids. Isn't the fact that you're setting aside time out of your life to disprove God proof that God does in fact exist? Because if God did not exist, then there would be no need to prove this argument. But the fact that there is opposition should prove that there is something and someone to believe in. You don't find as many people going out of their way to disprove any other religion. There is always going to be opposition of what is good, because we live in a world where there is both good and evil. So, have you ever considered that, whether you believe in God or not, you could actually be playing into the hands of whatever is in opposition to God?
I'm sorry, I haven't got my hearing aids in, that's why I'm I mean, these are philosophical questions that I find very hard to answer. And I would prefer, just like the question was over there, somebody asked something like, well, is it fair to do something like this? Well, fair to one person is not fair to another person. It's the same sort of thing about defining morals. You know, it's not all religious people that are moral or immoral. It's not all scientists that are moral and immoral. I'd like to use one example of where the science is going today. There are now laboratories in the world where we're making our own cells. And those cells are being used now in China and Japan to make new humans. Now, there is an ethical question here. Should we allow the scientists to continue with that, or should we not? And I have great difficulties with that. I don't believe, I believe the science is at that stage now that we can do this, but should we allow it? You know, 20, 30 years ago when I was still an undergraduate, cells were taken from one place and they were made sheep out of them. Sheep grew out of this. So this science is moving under a hell of a rate. And it's now almost out of control in terms of who are the people who are doing this. Are they doing it secretly somewhere in a laboratory? Or is this really scientifically controlled? Society must take some stand here and saying the scientists shouldn't be doing certain things right now, like, for example, creating a human being out of a new cell that they have produced in the laboratory. Is that? And that is part of where the questions of evolution are coming from, you know. This is close to really understanding how these cells behave, how they interact, and what we can do with them now artificially.
Thank you, Martin. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I will have to call this a day. I'm going to allow 2 more questions, and that will be the end. I can't guarantee it, but this will certainly not be the last such occasion. We will try to plan one again, maybe early next year. So there will be another opportunity in the future. As I said, I'll allow 2 more questions. This lady, and then the lady on the other side. So it's 1 and 2. Thank you. So,
I don't need a mic. I can project loud enough. My question was
just that, could you please stand and just...
My question was for Professor Olivier, and it's really, you kind of created this kind of false dichotomy, I think, about the relationship between knowledge and faith, and then in one of the responses you illustrated sort of that there actually is a relationship between the two. In the example that you used, that if I tell you that someone is a thief and they prove themselves to be a thief, they are a thief. The fact that you didn't know that didn't change the fact of that situation. So I just want to know if, would you be open to that idea in relation to belief itself, and that the fact that it's not necessarily something that you've experienced personally doesn't relegate that it can be an experience for someone else?
Oh, I readily grant that other people have experience of faith. I've already said that. But don't confuse faith with belief that relates to something that can be tested, that can be checked. I mean, we have various grounds for belief. It has to do with what in philosophy we call truth theories. There's a correspondence theory of truth. If I say to you, there's a fly on the wall, you can look and you can check whether I'm speaking the truth or not. If I say to you, this pen works better than any other pen I've ever used, you can put that to the test by trying yourself. And that's what we call the pragmatic theory of truth, to see whether doing something actually produces what it claims to be doing. There are various ways of checking things. That has to do with belief. The difference with religious faith is that there's no way that anybody can test that belief, except by saying, I believe. You know, like that song from Bach. I know that my believers, Redeemer liveth. How do you know that? It's faith. It's not knowledge of a philosophical kind, a scientific kind, or anything else. The two things are of a different order.
Thank you, Brad. I think if philosophy doesn't work for you in future, you could consider a singing career. Perhaps just on that note, it's probably not my privilege as the moderator, but I'd like to just make a comment. You don't have to respond to it. One of the big challenges in physics is to try and solve complicated problems, and often design equations that accommodate all the variables to get to a sensible answer. And often the equations are imperfect because we haven't accounted for all the variables. So it's just a thought, you can think about it.
Can I respond to that?
Just a final point from my side. Maybe just the thought that we might be reducing humanity to less than what it actually is.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, capitalism makes of humanity commodities. We are far more than that. I mean, I know some people who would probably sell their grandmother if they could make money out of it. Human beings are far more than what you can reduce them to, but while we were talking about physics and so on, I think that I disagree with something that Professor Stucker said earlier referring to science, and that people often use in this kind of argument about God. Nothing comes from nothing, you know, that kind of thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand quantum mechanics correctly, in quantum mechanics at a subatomic level, random events happen that don't have an assignable cause. Nothing. Can we there say that there's a cause for something? I mean, I've read several interpretations, like the Czech Milic Čapek, his interpretation of, he's a physicist.
Yeah,
and he said at that level, things happen that don't have causes.
I think the argument is simply that we're trying to solve a very complex equation, often ignoring some of the variables. And therefore, our perception of reality or truth may be extremely skewed. So one more question, and then I'm going to I'm going to ask Marie to close this meeting. It has indeed been a great pleasure. In fact, before I do that, the last question was this lady. That will be the end of the proceedings. Last question, then Marie, you will do the vote of thanks for us. Get on the stage, it's quicker.
Thank you.
anyone who would like to answer, or anyone who's most passionate about it.
You mean anybody on the panel or
Anybody,
anybody out
it's a
there?
different statement. But you've spoken a lot about the advancements that science and theology have had over time with new discoveries. And it's clear that as humans, our beliefs are changeable by our own understanding and perception of theology and science. So what is the defining factor that encourages you to put gravity in what you're saying, knowing that a new discovery could be made and the world could advance past what you're thinking now?
I think the short answer for me is that I would try to argue that a lot of what I think I believe philosophically could be altered if certain fundamental commitments I have philosophically I was disabused of them, which would include things like my confidence in empirical experience, a classical empirical experience, where Aristotle, through what he sees, hears, tastes, touches, and smells, gets metaphysics, logic, ethics, and God. And I challenge my students to say, well, how do you get from what you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell to those kind of abstracts? If somehow I was disabused of my confidence that what I see, hear, taste, touch, or smell is what I see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, then maybe that would begin to sort of weaken my confidence. Another would be the laws of logic. If I somehow started doubting the law of non-contradiction, and I've known people that have gotten to those stages in their life, and for reasons that I don't envy. But anyway, if that happened to me, then I suppose then I would start to probably not be the committed theist and then Christian that I am if I thought logic didn't apply to reality and knowledge begins in the senses. Because both of those are the bedrock of classical philosophy all the way up through until about the 17th century.
Philosophy, as I understand it, is always predicated on the revisability of knowledge. And that is demonstrated by the fact that something that Professor Howes just mentioned, namely the law of non-contradiction, has been demonstrated as not holding under all conditions in post-structuralist logic. In a book by a Hofstadter called Gödel, Escher, Bach, for example, he demonstrates that. But most of the post-structuralist thinkers I'm familiar with, like Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, those people. I'll give you one small example. Shows that Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, namely A equals A, and it's impossible that A equals B. If A is A, then A cannot be B at the same time. Okay? Well, take Jacques Lacan's model of the human psyche. He says all human beings are precariously stretched between three different registers of subjectivity: the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. The imaginary is the register in which we find our identity, our ego identity, where you call yourself a name with a telephone number, where you were born, and so on. Things that give you a certain certainty. Then there's the symbolic. The symbolic is the realm of the register of language. But language, when we speak, we draw on a register of symbols that we are not conscious of all the time. We actually draw from the unconscious, which is why Lacan says the symbolic is structured, the unconscious rather, is structured like a text, okay, like language. And then there's the final register, the real. The real is that in us which is pure potential. It could be the monster in you, it could be the saint in you. You don't know what. Under certain circumstances, it may come out and you can't predict that. Now, both the symbolic and the real undermine the register of the imaginary, which is your ego register. In other words, you are and you are not who you think you are.
I think this is exactly what defines evolution. You're going to change, the system changes. And in particular cases that you might be talking about, if we have a new discovery, we will change our scientific thinking. And the complexities of how society deals with that, it makes societal changes, economic changes, the entire system rearranges itself as we get a new discovery. and so forth. And that is exactly what evolution is about. Natural systems, today it's with the social systems, complex way that systems adapt to these inventions. That is the long-term evolution, and it's impossible to predict right now. No scientist can do that, how this complexity will evolve into the future.
Thank you very much.
Can I also say something?
Yeah.
Sorry. I think we talked a lot about, you asked the question, we talked a lot about what we believe. Actually, it's all about worldview. And why do you look to the world as you look to the world? And that had a big influence, and your paradigm can shift between them when you get certain things, but you're at that certain point. And I can relate to different things. So what brings me to a very important point, and I think everyone must consider that. If they were really nothing, and I'm not talking about quantum mechanics where there is something that spontaneously do something, but really nothing, it cannot just evolve. And
You can't change if you have nothing.
correct, I agree totally. You cannot change, and that's why the important.
Asking about change.
And that's why the important responsibility together with change. If we're working in a change world, we're not there just to survive. We're there to make an input that make a difference, and I think we all will agree with that. And that puts humanity on another level, just as instinct with animals or chemical reactions.
Ladies and gentlemen, then a last word from my side. I would just like to thank you for your attendance and for your interest in what has happened here this evening. As I said, I can't predict when it will be happening again, but we would certainly, in the near future, be having a similar event, and we will advertise it. And those people that didn't have a chance tonight to pose a question, I promise you next time I will make sure that you just remind you that you were keying up for the question. I'll make sure to get a chance. Thank you very much once again, and keep well.
So we just put our hands together just one more time for our panel friends. We have a gift for them. To Prof. Andre Fenter. Let's give him a hand, friends. The good news is there's an apologetics conference starting tomorrow night, Friday night, and through Saturday till about 3 o'clock. It's down at a church just down the road called Summerstrand United Church. If you want to hear more of the same in a kind of a lecture environment, also some Q&A, some other speakers are joining us. There's a place to sign up outside the lecture room at the bottom as you go out. Rob Swan and a few guys will be there to sign you up. Some of these guys are speaking there as well. If you're a student, we hope you're going to survive your exams. Is there anything else? I think that's it. Thanks so much for being here.